Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. Steve Soechtig is the global CEO of Ogilvy's experience business, which is helpfully known as Ogilvy Experience. He's based in Denver, Colorado. Steve's focus is the broader customer journey from the initial brand awareness all the way through to managing a customer relationship. And this is quite a change from the more traditional focus on post-purchase customer service alone. So I asked him about the evolution of CX and how brands can really build customer relationships every time they engage. Steve, it's great to have you on the podcast. Normally, we have sort of pure play CX experts on this podcast. And I know that you're very focused on brand engagement. And that's really interesting because I think if we look back in time, then we've seen this evolution of customer service to customer experience, but it's always focused on a kind of post-purchase interaction with the customer. You know, that they bought something, they have a problem or a complaint or a question, and so they get in touch with a brand. What's happened? How would you describe the evolution since that time when the customer only ever contacted a brand after they'd actually bought something?
Yeah, and that's extremely well said. And again, Mark, thank you for the opportunity to join you on the podcast today. Historically, certainly before the advent of digital platforms, brand and experience remained relatively independent in the way that you described it. You used your brand amplification and your traditional marketing techniques in order to establish the positioning and the unique differentiation of the products and or services that you provided, but you also used it as an avenue to be able to articulate your mission and also your personality as a brand. You then had, again, in a pre-digital world, the convenience or the luxury, if you will, of being able to train your employees so that when that customer did engage with the brand in a customer service situation or potentially re-engagement, perhaps they're looking to purchase additional products or simply to re-patronize the brand and revisit. You ensure that those employees knew the process of amplifying that brand message and reinforcing it in every interaction. It was very clean and it was very simple. And then, of course, the internet came upon us, and soon thereafter, we all had smartphones, and now we have digital assistants, and we have intelligent televisions, and even our appliances, we're able to communicate with them and interact and even transact with devices that 25 years ago, this would have been the topic of science fiction. So the challenge this has created is now, in many respects, the brand has lost that opportunity to control that narrative as cleanly as they used to be able. Because being able to predict where the individual is going to engage with the brand and at what stage in the buying journey has completely shifted. I could, for example, complete 50 to 60% of my research as a consumer via other platforms and sites and communication channels, and then elect to engage with the brand in one of the latter stages of transaction. Or I could even, and quite frequently now, purchase the product itself via a marketplace and then begin engaging with the brand directly, using your example, in customer service. So today's brands and today's marketers need to be thinking about every stage of that customer journey and all of the different ways within which a consumer can engage, and ensure that that same brand messaging, that same positioning, that same voice and personality and distinctive value proposition is conveyed and articulated against all those different potential touch points. And then that consistency becomes so very critical, because the moment it deviates is a moment that you're fracturing that relationship with that customer, and ultimately you're diminishing the power of your overall brand platform and messaging, and you'll find yourself on the back foot, if you will, in trying to create and sustain that relationship. It's a very tricky time we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you mentioned there quite a lot of different touch points along the customer journey, you know, and traditionally that's from the point at which there's this initial awareness of a product through the research, the purchase, the kind of post-purchase relationship. traditionally, that covers a lot of different silos within most traditional sort of organizations, sales, marketing, advertising, PR, customer service, and all of these are customer facing processes. But it seems that recently smarter or maybe more far-sighted brands are actually blending all of this and saying that everything that touches the customer has to be either a single team or it has to at least be coordinated. I mean, is that becoming essential now?
Yeah, that's absolutely critical and very well articulated in terms of the direction that we're seeing forward thinking and even now mainstream brands beginning to adopt is that exact concept. Oftentimes we're seeing it consolidated under titles like Chief Digital Officer or Chief Customer Officer, or we're even starting to see Chief Experience Officer. And that is not intended to imply that a single individual would have the ability to both coordinate and ultimately orchestrate all of those touch points in isolation. It simply is indicative of the fact there are now functions within our clients' brand companies that focus exclusively on that coordination across every stage in the journey, looking at it from a channel perspective, looking at it from a touch point perspective in terms of the journey of that customer, and then ultimately looking at it from an ecosystem perspective, which is a complexity that, again, most brands didn't have to wrestle with 25, 30 years ago. But where else could my brand be being amplified, influenced, and ultimately promoted that's completely outside of my corporate environment? So a critical function in today's age. And those that have not adopted this are those that are suffering the consequences of a very inconsistent message out in the marketplace.
And so if you're talking to a client or a potential client and they're asking, how can I revitalize my customer service? And then you turn around and say, actually, you need to revitalize and build an ongoing relationship with your customers. This is not just a process or a post-purchase process. How do you explain the difference to a potential customer between how they think of service traditionally and what they need to be thinking of?
Yeah, so I would say that the traditional view, and it is still held by, unfortunately, several brands today, is that customer service is reactive. And by that, what I mean is when a customer comes to the company with either an issue, with a question, with an inquiry, or even with an opportunity, they then respond to that. Whereas today's forward-thinking brands in this digital economy, they're thinking much more proactively and understanding what will this customer want and what will this customer need. And the greater the level of insight that they can develop in terms of that customer and their expectations, their needs, and then their potential future demands, give them an opportunity to be more proactive, actually reach out and develop a dialogue, a true two-way communication with that customer. That is the foundation of any relationship. But it's a relationship that's built on value. Again, not built on simply resolution of given situations or even fulfillment of given transactional needs. Instead, start thinking of, for my product or service, what is the ultimate problem and or desire that it is looking to solve, and how can I help to shape that resolution with a community of customers to inspire them to understand how they could apply my product or service to whatever it is that they are looking to address at that moment in time. Give them value-added information proactively that assists them in the evaluation, but at the same time steer them to your brand and to the experiences you offer in order to fulfill that need. So that was a lot of abstraction. Let's try to put that in something very real. Yes, it's we're of course right now coming into the autumn season here in the Northern Hemisphere, but you start to think about holidays. And as we approach the holiday season in much of the Northern Hemisphere, what are people thinking about? They may be, even in the COVID environment, thinking about family gatherings. Perhaps they're planning meals and they're planning events. They want to create fun experiences that build the memories around the holidays. They're thinking about gifts. They're looking for inspiration and ideas. They may be thinking about holiday travel and where can I find the right opportunities and the most cost-effective methods to be able to get together with family and with friends during this time. Instead of just providing, say, a browser and mobile app experience where I can look up recipes, I can book my travel, I can even buy books on a commerce site, why not push ideas to them proactively? Think about the combination of all this together and present that to them in an emotion-filled narrative that draws upon the desire that we all have to be back together, to enjoy that holiday season, to celebrate one another, and then wrap all of that emotion around whatever it is, the product or the service that the brand provides. That's the pivot that these brands are looking to make. Not that different than what we did 30 years ago when we would all be watching television, listening to the radio, or reading the newspaper, and we would see advertisements that would have wonderful imagery of the family together, perhaps around a fire. There might be gifts under a tree if it's Christmas season, or a wonderful dinner on the table at Thanksgiving. What we're doing now is we're taking that imagery and we're putting value on top of it. Here are 5 creative recipe ideas for that table. Here are 10 innovative gift ideas for that hard-to-shop person in your life, whatever that may happen to be. It's just that added value and proactive understanding of what that individual might be thinking about that inspires them to engage and to ultimately begin the journey with your brand.
Yeah, it's very emotive. You know what you're describing there. There's this idea of inspiring the customer, predicting what they need, giving them ideas around how to interact with your products. And I think that, clearly there is an emotional relationship that you're building between the brand and the customer here. But can that have any pitfalls? I mean, can that desire to sort of create a much closer relationship actually go wrong if perhaps you demand trust from the consumer and then you let them down, perhaps?
Yeah, there's actually a few dimensions to that. That's such a great question. And you're absolutely right. From the beginning of time in the world of branding, it has always been about creating an emotional connection with the consumer, understanding what are the triggers that will inspire the specific action that you're looking for. And we always think of those triggers as being anticipatory, right? We always think that I'm hungry, so as a food service restaurant brand, I want to present my foods, or I'm excited, back to the idea of travel, and I want to present the most compelling travel package to satisfy that itch. And those are real emotions, but there's many emotions that are evolved in customer experience. I could be anxious. Maybe I'm a healthcare brand and I'm looking to instill that sense of calmness and that sense of reassurance that my practice and my group of physicians, hospitals, nurses, and care is the right answer for helping you on your health journey from this point forward. I could be frustrated. It may be that I am engaging in a customer service situation and I'm looking for rapid answers, and I don't want to get stuck in some type of circular loop of automated responses when I'm just trying to get a resolution to whatever my problem is as quickly as possible. So there's a full spectrum of emotions that the consumer may have, and at any given time, they may actually have multiple emotions in play. So the first emotive question and the first risk that brands need to address and ensure that they avoid is going to be that they misunderstand the emotion of the individual and they attempt to leverage and evoke the wrong response to the emotion that's in place. That sounds like a very difficult exercise in a digital world where oftentimes you don't know who that person is. All that does is reinforce the criticality of data, because the more data that you have, the more attribution that you can give back to the path the individual took to get to where they are in the experience, the more predictive you can become into why they are there and what the drivers are behind their current engagement, and that gives you that insight. So that's risk one, is making sure that you have as much insight into the individual as you can. But with that automatically brings up risk two, which is you have to be very careful that you don't overexpose the fact that you have insight into that individual. And I'm not talking about Cambridge Analytica level data, right, where I have specifics about individuals, but people even get anxious when they suspect that in any way you're developing insight about them. It's the ultimate digital paradox. We all want the most personalized and specific interactions that already have anticipated why I've landed at that stage in my interaction journey with that brand, but you better not know anything about me. So it's almost an impossible balance to strike, but it's a balance that brands are continuously finding the right answer to address in order to give that personalized experience without tipping over into the what I just lovingly call the creepiness factor. The idea that I was sitting in my living room and I was talking about a new pair of shoes, and then the next time I log into my browser, those shoes are popping up as a display ad, as a simple example. There's a creepiness factor to that, even though it could only be coincidental, and perhaps I was also looking at those shoes online 3 days earlier. So you're always striking that balance, and again, you're looking to contain that emotion. But then the third, and probably the most significant risk that you can take is overplaying the evocation of that emotion, and back to exactly what you said, not fulfilling that specific need. It happens. I see it continuously with brands in digital experiences. They truly overcommit in terms of what they express to be either the capability or the structure of what it is that they're offering. And then when you actually start to engage and look to commit as a consumer, they're not able to fulfill it. Simple examples I'll offer would be that I build a basket full of products only to discover down the chain that there's an out of stock or a delay condition in fulfillment. Hidden charges are certainly another one. Misaligned expectations in terms of anything having to do with the service. And then finally, the fourth that you see so very often is any type of complex online or interactive process for completing a transaction or an interaction. Any of those take that heightened emotional state that the brand has successfully created and convert that into the inverse reaction that they're looking to evoke, which typically is anger and frustration that leads that person to abandon, and it becomes very difficult to get them back.
Yeah, and you're talking very much about the experience the customer has, so how do they emotionally feel when they interact, or when they make a purchase, or even when they just have any kind of engagement with the brand. And I guess that you could summarize that as like an experience economy, because it applies across every industry. But how do you talk to the companies that you work with and sort of move them on from where they've been to redefining the way they talk to their customers as part of this experience economy? Because I think that, as an example, look at what happened to retail during COVID. Suddenly you had stores that were closed. They had to do curbside pickup, click and collect. The ones that were not really big on e-commerce suddenly had to launch direct-to-consumer services, and so they really had to reshape their offer almost overnight just to survive. But then they really had to redefine what the customer experience was as well at the same time. So how do you help your clients sort of see the light then about the wider experience economy?
Yeah, typically it's a two-step process along the way. The first is isolating and understanding what their objectives are as a brand. And when I initially asked that question of a new client or a new business relationship, I inevitably get the same answer, which is we want to grow. Well, that's very admirable, and most brands want to grow. It's a rare occurrence that anybody would have a different strategy, but you really start to drill into what growth means. Are you looking to grow in terms of bringing new customers to the brand with the recognition of the cost associated in customer acquisition? or are you looking to grow the value of your existing customer relationships? And if you're looking to grow the value, are you looking at transactional value at the moment? Are you looking at lifetime value? Are you looking at sustainability of a customer relationship or frequency of interaction? You really start to focus on a business conversation that is outcome specific and ask that second, that third, and that fourth question. And suddenly you might determine hypothetically that when this particular client and this executive is talking about growth, what they are saying is that they're trying to attract 18 to 25-year-old women in the northeastern United States that have a minimum of high school education and at the upper edges, college education that are specifically career motivated in the early stages of developing the professional lifestyle, right? I got very specific there intentionally, but that's the kind of specificity you start to get into. And then I look to draw anecdotal examples of how other brands have been able to capture whatever it is that brand is looking to capture in terms of that KPI, because that, in my view, is the only credible method of proving a point. You can't prove a negative, as we all say. So trying to explain that doing nothing will lead to negative returns is a very difficult argument to make, particularly in today's world where most individuals and most organizations are overtapped and under-resourced. So the natural default, through, again, no fault of their own, is, well, we need to postpone that because we just don't have the time, we don't have the resource, and we don't have the money to take that on. But if you can demonstrate how others have driven success through the techniques that we are promoting, you can then to build momentum around this and create that business case based on those results to say, if you receive similar outcomes, this will become self-funding over this period of time. And then you're able to swing them over and build the momentum around whatever it is that you're suggesting they employ. And then once you get that vision in place and you've started to build that excitement, then step back. And by that, what I mean is, don't bite the entire elephant all at once. Take one small piece and eat that elephant over time. Find a piece of scope that's small, that's discrete, that ultimately will have some form of measurable output, and then bound that into a short period of time, demonstrate results, and move to the next step, and allow that momentum to naturally develop over time. And even the most slow-moving brands, and there are those out there in the market, as we all know, will begin to create their own internal momentum and begin to transform in the direction that we as customer experience experts know they need to progress if they want to continue to survive in this digital and post-digital transformation economy.
Is it difficult to get executives to think about the total lifetime value that you just talked about? Because I think that normally when we talk within designing a customer experience solution, all of the metrics are very transactional. They're focused on how have we dealt with this individual customer interaction? How quickly did we get them off the phone? This kind of thing. And,
right.
And I remember an experiment that I think it was Domino's Pizza did, where they trained their employees to imagine $10,000 like tattooed across the forehead of every customer, and that is how much this customer is worth to us over the lifetime of them buying pizza, and it dramatically improved the customer experience there, because things like a cold pepperoni, nobody was arguing about it. They just got a fresh one immediately. And but how do you go about that? Because everything that you talked about just now, it kind of depends on them buying into a whole new relationship with the customer.
Yeah, and oftentimes that is lost in the world of individual measurement and also time-bound measurements, particularly for public companies that have to remain focused on quarterly results and ultimately their annual reports, right? So when you start to talk about 3 and 5 year time horizons, it's very compelling in its own right, but then ultimately they fall back on what does it mean inside of this quarter. Plus, then you have individuals, and let's be honest, as professionals, we are all driven by the measurements that are put against the role that we currently have within the organization. And oftentimes those measurements are not long-range KPIs. They're immediate, to your point of, did I improve my call center average handle time? Or did I reduce the customer acquisition cost at this moment in time, right? It becomes very tactical. That is why when building out a strategy and trying to paint this vision that can be multi-year in scope, it is so critical to then break that down into discrete parts and consider, just as you do the customer, consider who it is in the organization you're talking to. Or if you yourself are the individual that is looking to sponsor this type of initiative, think of your own measurements and think of the measurements of those around you who are going to be active participants, and shape the initial stages of the transformation against those measurements. If you need quarterly returns and you have specific KPIs that you need to hit, find within that overall transformation where is the greatest opportunity to impact those metrics initially, and take that on first. But take that on with the recognition that it is a small step in a long roadmap, and that you are going to then take progressive steps, but that by proving out the success in this short-term initiative, you will build the momentum either within your client's organization or within your own organization that will inspire others to then join you in the journey and say, okay, let's take my measurements on next. And soon you discover you have an entire organization that is marching forward and grabbing that $10,000 value per customer the way that Domino's did.
Yeah, and to create that kind of insight needs data. And you mentioned earlier this whole idea of the uncanny valley, when you kind of trip over into that environment where the customer actually starts feeling uncomfortable.
Yes.
Where is it easy to define where that point is, or is the problem that it's variable for every customer?
It's I would say both variable for every customer, and then it varies over time. It swings back and forth, as we've so often seen. And examples exist in the public domain, everything from what social media platforms have been dealing with, to what retailers have been struggling with, to what some of the digital pure plays who had the permission to get away with a lot more in early days of their evolution are now struggling with. So again, it is critical to collect as much data as possible, but equally recognize that you need to manage how you use that data and express the insights of that data. And test is the advice that I offer to every client. Test by first and foremost going out into your markets and asking customers who are willing to communicate with you what they are looking for in terms of personalized experiences, and then be transparent with them and ask the question of, in order to give you this experience, would you be comfortable with me leveraging recognition of past purchases that you've made? Would you be comfortable with me recognizing your geography or the time of day or the path that you took to come into this specific interaction? And really start to test the market as much as you can through the constituents that matter, which are the individuals that ultimately will be engaging with your brands, customers, prospective customers, etc. But you're not always going to be able to develop that insight. It can be expensive to create that insight. And again, there are certain questions you may simply not want to ask. So then that's when you can begin to run internal tests and kind of push the edges of how you are doing this. Again, never breaching any type of societal contract, of course, legal contract or regulatory contract. That's not what I'm suggesting, but just pushing the limits of personalization until you start to see through the resulting data that there's a degradation in terms of the outcomes, if that's a conversion or progression to the next step or deeper engagement in some way, shape, or form. you can rapidly identify when I've taken this a stage too far and fall back and understand that you're at the limits of how you can leverage data to create your personalization.
Okay, yeah, that's really, really good advice there. Yeah. I mean, just to wrap up now, is there anything about the past year and a half, which has been probably the most disruptive period for all of our careers so far, hopefully forever?
Yes.
Is there anything about this time that has changed the experience economy, either stalling, accelerating, or just changing dramatically? What have you seen change in this environment because of COVID then?
Yeah, well, some of them have been obvious and well published. It fascinated me to discover, I guess, just being so embroiled in this industry for the past 20 plus years, I did not fully appreciate that the growth rate of online commerce could increase so significantly due to a single event, be it a global event such as the COVID pandemic. But of course, we saw accelerated rates of online commerce, 40% year over year, whereas previously we were enjoying, give or take, 10% year over year growth most years across most industries. So certainly a shift and a comfort level with operating online and extending what we were willing to do online into more and more domains. One of the most notable being grocery shopping. A lot of people would often say, one, I don't find it inconvenient to go to my neighborhood grocer and to pick up my items, and I like the immediate gratification and convenience of having them with me. And two, I want the control of being able to select my products, particularly those on the perimeter of the store, your produce, your meats, your dairy, and other perishable goods. People forewent that, some because they had to during lockdown periods, others because it gave them an opportunity to discover the convenience of it. And now people are feeling more comfortable extending online experiences into new domains. So I would say that certainly is one. The second is that I think we are discovering now that people's expectations of what they are going to be able to do, how they are going to be able to interact, and the level of sophistication that they will receive via any type of digital or online interface is higher than it's ever been. Again, by a multiple factor over 2019. They're expecting intelligent, AI-driven, two-way conversational interfaces because brands were rapidly rolling that out during a period that they couldn't staff their call centers. They expect fulfillment centers to give them real-time visibility into both the standard 1PL and 3PL fulfillment processes, but also they want equal transparency into any disruptions so that they know in real time exactly what is happening with their product or with their service and whether or not they need to prepare for any type of disruption. We always said that in the digital economy that the customer had unrealistic expectations. COVID just took those unrealistic expectations and elevated them by a factor of about 5. And brands are going to have to move that much more quickly in order to keep up. And if they don't, again, consumers and business customers are not going to have the tolerance to wait for them. And they're not going to have the willingness, it appears, to go back to the old ways of working. They want to stay with these new models. They've grown comfortable with these new models. And again, they're going to be expecting to be able to utilize these new models likely into perpetuity.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favorite podcast provider because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or ideas, people, or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.